Monster Hunter Stories 3 Twisted Reflection launches March 13th, 2026. And after playing many hours of Stories 2, I have some big hopes for what this game could become. From story improvements to big combat changes, talk about what could make Monster Hunter Stories 3 the best in the series. Let's start with the biggest change in the story. If you've played Stories 1 or 2, you know the stories were, let's say, lighthearted in a sense. We had Nabiru cracking jokes every few seconds. And while I somewhat enjoyed the little guy, it made some serious moments really hard to take seriously. But Stories 3? It's going in a completely different direction. For the first time in the series, we have a voiced protagonist with their own personality. No more silent hero while Nabiru does all the talking. This is huge because it means we can actually have meaningful character development and emotional investment in the story. And speaking of the story, Stories 3 is set against the backdrop of an ecological disaster. There is mass extinction event targeting monsters, with these feral crystals contaminating the environment. On top of that, you've got two nations with rising political tensions. This is not the goofy adventures we had before. Now, here's what I'm hoping for. I want a story that respects my intelligence as a player. I want NPCs with actual depth, not just comic relief characters. I want to feel like my choices actually matter, even if it's just through some dialogue options. And I want companion characters like Rudy, the new feline partner, to have real personalities and story arcs. Stories 2 had some great moments, for sure, but they were always undercut by the tone. Stories 3 has the chance to tell a genuinely compelling story about conservation, conflict, and the relationship between humans and monsters. That's the kind of narrative depth that I am really hoping for. Now, let's talk about combat, because Stories 3 is making some really interesting changes here. If you're familiar with Stories 2, you know the combat is based on a rock, paper, scissors type system. Power beats tech, tech beats speed, speed beats power, and that's staying. But there's a new twist. In Stories 2, your weapon skills and your ability to ride your Monstie both use the same kinship gauge. This meant that you had to choose. Do I use my powerful weapon skills, or do I save it to ride my Monstie? It was a decent system, but it could feel really limiting. In Stories 3, it appears to introduce a separate stamina meter, although the exact implementation isn't exactly confirmed yet. If this system works as we expect, it could mean managing 2 resources instead of 1, with stamina potentially handling weapon abilities, while the kinship gauge remains for Monstie skills. This could add a genuine strategic depth, creating scenarios where you need to decide, do I burn my stamina now to break this part, or do I save it for when the monster enrages? That's the kind of decision-making that could make the combat more engaging. However, until we see more official gameplay footage or detailed explanations from Capcom, the exact mechanics of how stamina and kinship systems interact in Stories 3 remain yet to be confirmed. Then there's the new feral monsters. These are creatures infected with crystals that appear to enhance or change their abilities. While the exact mechanics aren't fully detailed yet, these crystal-infected monsters seem to be designed to create a more tactical encounter. These crystals likely add new layers of strategy to combat, potentially requiring players to approach these fights differently than standard monsters. This could be exactly the kind of tactical puzzle that makes the boss fights a bit more engaging, although we'll need to see more gameplay to understand the specific mechanics involved. What I am really hoping for is that every major fight in Stories 3 feels like this, like a little puzzle that you have to solve, not just a race to do the most damage. I want to feel like I'm actually hunting these monsters, studying the patterns, and exploiting their weaknesses. That's what made mainline Monster Hunter great, and I think that Stories 3 can capture that feeling in a turn-based format. And one more thing, weapon balance. In Stories 2, some weapons just felt way better than others. I'm hoping Stories 3 makes all 3 weapon types feel equally viable with unique playstyles. Give me a reason to switch weapons mid-fight and not just stick with 1 or 2 the whole time. Alright, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or should I say, the Rathalos in the room. The gene system. If you've played Stories 2, you know the rite of channeling was somewhat complicated. You had this 3x3 grid of genes, and you could transfer genes from one Monstie to another by sacrificing them. Get 3 matching genes in a row, and you get a bingo bonus. It's a cool system in theory, but in practice, a lot of players found it confusing. The game did not explain it well, and it was hard to visualize what you were actually accomplishing. So here's my first hope. Better tutorials. Give me in-game recommendations. Show me what genes work well together. Make it clear what I'm gaining from each transfer. But beyond just explaining it better, I'm hoping the gene system itself gets some quality of life improvements. Let me preview stat changes before I commit to a transfer. Let me save gene builds maybe so I can experiment without losing progress. And maybe give me a recommended build option for players who just want to optimize without doing the math. Now, for Monsties themselves, I want variety, not just in what monsters are available, but in how they play. Give me Monsties with unique riding actions that actually matter for exploration. In Stories 2, you'd unlock Jump, Swim, Rock Break, and then you'd find 5 different Monsties with the same ability. I want more Monsties to feel special and more unique. And here's a big one. Endgame content. Stories 2 post-game was okay, but I'm hoping Stories 3 gives me a real reason to keep optimizing my builds. Challenging super bosses, maybe even a bit more balanced PvP if they include it. I want to feel like there's always something to work towards and not just beat the story and you're done. One last thing on Monsties. Signature moves. I want each Monstie to have its abilities that feel impactful and unique to them. Not just this one does fire damage and this one does water damage, or all monsters of the same type, like multiple different Rathaloses, have the same kinship skills essentially. Give me moves that change how I approach battles, that make me excited to try new compositions in changing out my Monsties. Let's also talk about the world itself, because Stories 3 is promising something bigger than we've ever seen before. The hub areas that we've seen in the previews are a fair bit larger than Stories 1 or 2, with multiple waypoints and more open exploration. I'm really hoping this translates to a world that feels more alive and rewarding to explore. What do I mean by that? I want hidden secrets. I want optional content that's actually worth finding. I want to stumble across a rare Monstie den and feel like I discovered something special, rather than, oh, just another monster den. In Stories 2, exploration could feel a bit linear. You'd go from point A to point B, fight some monsters, and move on. I'm hoping Stories 3 gives me reasons to wander off the beaten path, so to speak. And speaking of the world, dynamic encounters. We've seen footage of Gyprosaurus flying overhead, and they can knock it out of the sky with a breath attack. That's pretty cool. Give me more of that. Let the world feel reactive and interactive, not just a backdrop for battles. Now, for quality of life stuff, and this is important by the way, I want faster and easier menu navigation. Stories 2 had way too many button presses to do simple things. For example, we now have the ability to change your lead Monstie on the fly. Expand upon that, like when accessing items, checking the detailed map, and stuff like that. Let me customize my controls in more depth. These may seem like small things, but they add up over a 100-hour playthrough. Fast travel is another one. Stories 2 had somewhat limited fast travel points, which meant a lot of backtracking. I'm hoping that Stories 3 lets me fast travel a lot more easily, or at least gives me more waypoints. Respect my time as a player. And here's something else I'd love to see. Better multiplayer or co-op features. Imagine being able to team up with a friend for a tough boss fight, or trading eggs and items with other players, or even an entire story playthrough with a friend. Even just community features like sharing gene builds or Monstie teams would also be an amazing thing to have. Monster Hunter has always been about community, and I think that Stories 3 could embrace that better. So, we've talked about story, combat, Monsties, and the world. But here's the thing. All of these improvements would be great, but what would make Stories 3 truly special? For me, it comes down to 3 main things. First, respect for player time. I don't want to grind for hours and hours to get one rare gene or material. I don't want unskippable cutscenes on my second playthrough. I don't want to feel like the game is wasting my time. Give me meaningful progression and not just busy work. Second would be accessibility. And I don't mean just difficulty options, although those would be great. I mean making the whole game welcoming to everyone. Adding colorblind modes, customizable controls, clear and more efficient tutorials that can be toggled off for veterans. Monster Hunter can be intimidating for newcomers, and Stories 3 has a chance to be the perfect entry point into the Monster Hunter franchise, if it's designed with accessibility in mind. And third, post-launch support. I want to know that Capcom is committed to this game beyond just launch day. Regular content updates, extra new monsties, story expansions, and community events show me that this isn't just a one-and-done release, but a game that will grow and expand over time, sort of like the title updates in the mainline series. If Stories 3 can deliver on these things, a mature, engaging story, deep but accessible combat, a world worth exploring, and respect for player time, it could be the best Monster Hunter Stories game we have ever had. And honestly, based on what we've seen so far, I think that Capcom is aiming for just that. Again, these are my personal biggest hopes for Monster Hunter Stories 3, but I want to hear from you. What are you most excited about? What features do you hope make it into the game? Drop a comment below and let's discuss. And if you are as hyped about Stories 3 as I am, make sure you're subscribed because I'll be covering this game extensively leading up to the launch and beyond. In the next video, we'll be talking about quality of life changes that need to be in Stories 3 in more detail. All the little improvements that would make the experience so much better. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.